Mind Your Farm Business on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I'm Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com and host of Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM. You can find more episodes of this podcast by going to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. One of the biggest rewards of working in a family business is the opportunity to work every day with multiple generations. This can provide mentorship, learning, and truly rewarding memories and experiences. It can also provide challenges, let's be honest. And those challenges can be with lots of friction, it can create troubled relationships in and away from work. When it gets down to it, has having different generations in a business ever provided perfect relationships? Of course not. Generational differences are real, but also sometimes misunderstood as stereotypes skew perceptions and behaviors. Today's guest on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast is David Coletto. He is CEO of Abacus Data. He manages the day-to-day operations and leads Abacus Data's team of research consultants and strategists, delivering strategic advice and research design expertise to some of Canada's leading corporations, advocacy groups, and political leaders. A few years back, I saw David speak at a conference about the generational differences, and I thought he would be a perfect fit for this topic. Let's get to the conversation about managing and leading across multiple generations with David Coletto of Abacus Data. Hey, David, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Sean. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. So today we're going to talk about being in a business with multiple generations. And, to be honest, this is a lot of family farms across the country. Why is this at times such a struggle? Like, what? And I guess, first of all, before we get to why is it a struggle, what makes each generation different? Like, how does this actually happen?
Yeah, well, I think so. When we talk about generations, we're talking about a group of people born around the same time in which the environment and influences and the experiences that they've kind of shared all kind of come together to create differences in how they view the world, in what their priorities are, in how they use technology, right? Every generation this has happened. And so, generational turnover in a business, in any organization, has happened forever, right? It's just part of life. New generations come in and old ones go out, and that's normal. And I think every older generation, go back hundreds of years, has looked at the one that's come after it and said, hey, something's wrong with the kids, or they're just not right, they're lazy, they're entitled, they don't want to work as hard as I do. So that is, and I always hear it. I do a lot of public speaking on this. I travel all over the country, meeting with different industries, different sectors, and agriculture and farming is no different. So I come at this by saying, in order to really deal with it, to understand it, you've got to understand where different generations come from, right? And so when we think about any generation, I think there's two primary factors that matter into really understanding who they are. How were they raised, and what role has technology played in their lives, right? And technology has always been something that new generations have dealt with, right? For my grandfather, the shift from a rotary phone to a push phone was a significant shift. It maybe fundamentally didn't change the way he communicated, but it was a change. The introduction of photocopiers into offices or fax machines, right? But what's happened is with younger generations, that technological change has happened so rapidly that, you've seen actually big gaps between generations on how they get information, how they make decisions, how they work, how they communicate with each other, that it's exaggerated, I think, the differences between generations. Then add to the fact that, younger generations, particularly if you think of millennials, Gen Z, that's the two youngest ones in the labor market right now. They were raised, I think, on average, a typical experience very differently than, say, my parents, who were baby boomers, were raised, right? Much more flattened hierarchy, more feedback, more self-esteem building, right? You can do anything you want. And frankly, a lot of boomer parents, they got to either take the blame or credit for that. But nonetheless, that has created a different expectation about work and what work means. And so when you think about generational change, I always encourage audiences to just sit down and think about, if you've got kids, if you've got team members or employees who are of different generations, just try to imagine what their typical upbringing was like, because that gets you at least part way to understanding where they're coming from.
What about other influences? Because as you're talking about, the environment they grew up in, I was thinking about like the 60s and rock and roll. Like, that's not, and technology played a role in that, because music became more accessible to a broader audience with things like, the record and things like that. And of course, we ended up now where it's you can access music on your phone anytime you want, any song you want from a catalog. But there's pop culture influences too. Is there not, that kind of define a generation?
Absolutely. I mean, like the music you listen to, movies. I mean, the other unique thing about the last 20 years is it's also been really a creator culture, right? My father played the guitar, I think probably wanted to be in a band and, dreamed of that life, had a Camaro, wanted that kind of rocker lifestyle, but he could play in his basement, or he could play in the garage with his buddies, but he couldn't really reach an audience. Well, a 15-year-old today, right, can record themselves singing on YouTube, and if they hit it big, millions of people, right? That's how Justin Bieber was discovered, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very different landscape, in that technology has empowered people generally, but particularly young people, to believe that more is possible, right? The other thing technology has done is, again, I use my father again. He cared what people thought about him, right? He cared what his friends thought. He wanted to impress, folks like my mom, and all those kinds of things. But a 25-year-old today, or a 20-year-old or a 15-year-old, has hundreds of people in their broader network that they need to kind of impress. And they're being bombarded every day with images and stories about exceptionally amazing experiences that people are sharing on social media. Think of Instagram, TikTok. And so if you're, let's say you grew up in a small town, your dad or your uncle wants you to continue to be the dairy farmer that they've been for generations. And in previous generations, that was a secure path to a livelihood. It was something that was in the family. And some kids may not have wanted to do it, but they ended up doing it because, maybe there were no other options, or they felt really passionate about it. Today, that young kid might be exposed to far more options and might believe that more is possible. So it is just harder, I think, today. And we see it, we see, it's not just agriculture. Like, talk to folks in construction, talk to folks in trucking, mining, any of these kind of what I call legacy industries that are so important to our economy, are having such a hard time recruiting and retaining young people to stay in them, I think in part because of the image of them.
So if we know why generations are different, and how we would, if we self-reflected, we would understand, why, older people or younger people in generation, how there could be differences. Why are misunderstandings and assumptions such a challenge still? Because we understand, like, it's about the experiences as you described, but it seems like we're not learning. Like, why is that?
No, I think stereotypes just become so firm, right? Like, there was when I give a presentation, I show this front page of a Time magazine article from 2007 that says, the me generation, millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. Like, this is the front page of a major, American international magazine.
It's the paper of record.
Perpetuating a stereotype that, when I survey Canadians over the age of 40 and ask them, give me words to describe millennials, guess what? They use the exact same words, right? Mm-hmm. So people like me, I try to go and I try to break down those stereotypes to say, if you believe that every 20-year-old in your life, or 25-year-old or 30-year-old in your life, is a lazy, entitled narcissist, and you engage with them on that basis, you can't build a good relationship with them, right? So you have to understand, if you see entitlement, what does it mean? Well, my answer to that is, every generation has tried to move the bar up on what standard of living should be like, on what work should mean. You know, you take your average 60-year-old, rancher in Alberta. They've got they love their life, they love what they do. But I bet if I asked them, would you want to go and work in a factory in 1850? They would say no way, because and so a millennial says, I don't want to work in a workplace of the 1980s or 90s either. And so there's this constant evolution, which older generations, I think, just because of the nature of the way we talk about generational differences, they just reinforce those stereotypes instead of try to challenge them and figure out, how can I connect with someone who has been raised differently, technology has influenced them differently, and get them to see the opportunities that exist by working on our farm, or working in a mine, or driving a truck in and out of a forestry area.
We'll get back to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, but first a word from our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank.
This episode of Mind Your Farm Business podcast is brought to you by RBC. No matter where you're at in your agricultural career, succession has probably crossed your mind. Whether you have an idea to help the next generation thrive, or just want to get a head start, RBC can help tailor a succession plan for you. Ensure that ownership of your operation, as well as your skills and knowledge, are easily passed on. Visit rbc.com/succession to learn more.
So how do we make that connection? Because I think there's a lot of the audience that, okay, you know what? You're right. Maybe I have jumped to conclusions. Now, in some cases, there might be a track record where it's like, okay, my conclusion is not a stereotype, it's the actual fact. And in some cases, it's probably like, you know what? I've been kind of hard on that individual. And maybe what's missing is I'm not actually trying to make the connection. So how do we go about that?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to be wrong. I think this is just good leadership and good coaching generally, right? I think the best approach to dealing with younger generations is always to look at yourself as a coach, right? What does a coach want? A coach can be tough. A coach can, point out where you can improve. But at the end of the day, a player respects their coach because they believe that coach ultimately wants that player to do well, right? And I think what happens when we use stereotypes and these misconceptions to drive our decisions, our motivation to the other side of that table or conversation is questioned, right? That you actually don't want me to do well. You're just, judging me and questioning me, and you're never gonna see my side of the story. I also do think, by the way, the same lesson applies to young folks in the workplace, right? If you go into a conversation with your employer or your dad or your whoever it is, and you're refusing to see their perspective, then you're going to also fail, right? So but the problem is in the workplace today is employers don't have the luxury of hoping that, the young people coming into their teams do that. So it's really, given the labor market shortages, the tight labor market, it's dependent on us to figure out how to connect. And I think it starts with, as I said, just listening and being open to a different perspective. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up how the younger generation interacts with the older one, because we've been talking a lot about, from older to younger, because that's the one that's maybe people jump to first when they talk about this, because you always pick on the younger generation first. There's like there really is, you need to be able to, I guess, open your mind, whether you're the older or the younger generation, to sort of try to understand where they're coming from. And, I think we see this a lot of times in the farm, right? And it can come down to also like experiences, right? So we've been talking a lot about inflation a lot at RealAgriculture, of course. And when you talk about inflation, you talk about things like land prices, you talk about the 1980s, right? And so it's an opportunity for younger people to learn about the experiences that those people went through, where they maybe lost the farm, they had to restart, they had to scrape and claw, similar to a generation that went through the 30s. Like I always said, my grandfather, it was 1990, but he was still, the 30s had completely defined how he saw running a business. If there's an opportunity here also to learn too, right? In this moment of connection.
Absolutely. Like my view is the most successful teams, whether they're 2 people or 20 or 500, are the ones that are diverse, which means different generations working together, because you need people who are wise and have lived through things, who are willing to work with people who challenge the status quo, right? Who can offer an alternative way of doing something, right? And so you need somebody who's lived through the 80s to know what might come or how to adapt or change as a result. And then you need somebody who can say, well, I can find a quicker solution, right? To clear that field, Dad, or, to process that product, or, I live in a city. I'm a city boy. I admit it. I don't know the language of the farm, but I know there's even on farms, there's debates about which technology they should implement, right? And cross-generational fights over where we should invest our resources. And so I do think that the very best teams, the ones that are going to succeed and excel, are the ones that take advantage of the different perspectives, the lived experiences, and the ability, particularly for younger generations, to solve problems in ways that are probably faster and more cost-effective, but can be checked by an open-minded person who's lived through it and done it themselves.
Some of those stereotypes about generations that spin out there and are talked about, that I know you try to break down a lot of times, are some of those stereotypes actually correct? Like, is there underlying truth at all, or is it just labels we're pasting on certain age groups?
It's a great question. I think there is truth to some of them. I think as we as a society in Canada, for example, become wealthier, more educated, there becomes an entitlement to what we've expected out of life. And so when people say, oh, young people today are so entitled, well, every generation, I think, has developed new entitlement about what they should expect in their lives. So I think there's some truth to that. I don't buy the lazy label that people put on young people today. I think they're just probably more productive, and so they have more time to spend because technology enables them to do it. So I think some labels are fair and others are not. But the thing to always remember is when we talk about generations, we're talking about, let's say in Canada, millennials, there's 10 million of them. There's no possible way we can take a generic label and say, you all are the same, right? And so we also have to remind ourselves that a generational analysis is just a starting point to getting to know who the people on your team or in your family or in whatever universe you're working with, who they are, because we're each unique and individual. So the generational story gets you 40% of the way there. You might be able to understand who they are, but you've got to get to know your individuals on the team to really, I think, connect with them.
Okay, so because it's about the experiences, and we know prior to the age of 12 and 10 really define, things like personality. Are generations the same? Canada versus US, Canada versus Europe? And what are the differences between the developed and undeveloped world? Because if you take that last one, those experiences are massively different. So a millennial in Canada versus a millennial in Ghana are going to be way different, aren't they?
Completely.
Okay.
And they don't, the concept doesn't even really apply, right? Even the notion of a baby boomer is something that only really applies in Western Europe and North America, because post World War II, you had all these people returning home, haven't seen their spouses for a while, and boom, babies appear, right? So these are primarily North American and Western European concept, even more so North American. And you see it even if you talk to, and I've done research with, first generation families in Canada, right? And the way that their households operate, or the relationship between parents and their kids, is much more like how my grandparents, who were immigrants from Italy, interacted with their kids 40 years ago, but that's happening today, right? And that's because the cultural experience, whether it's cultural or socioeconomic or more just the context, is different, right? And so when I talk about the typical millennial experience in Canada, which is one of growing up typically in a wealthier country, lots of education, lots of extracurriculars, lots of people around you who can love you and guide you and support you. That is definitely not the typical experience of somebody growing up in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in China, where the political situation is so different. So these concepts I think they don't travel wide. And I don't even think that's why I talk about typical experience as opposed to assuming everyone born in 1985 is going to be the same. You got to, it's 40% of the story. You got to talk to the rest.
Yeah. Very, very fascinating. David, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate that. This is such an important topic because on a family farm, we are dealing with multi-layers of generations, and everybody has to work together. I think you brought up some very good points on what makes a really great team, and it very much describes the family farm business unit is, like you said, having those experiences, having that youth of new ideas and enthusiasm and, using that lack of experience sometimes to your advantage, putting that all together in a synergistic ball, that is a great team. I thought you described that very well.
Thanks. It's great to chat.
When it comes to managing different generations, it's so easy to fall into the traps of stereotypes. Listen, don't be lazy. A leader must understand their own behaviors while also understanding what is important to other generations and their backgrounds. This is not easy. And honestly, it can be frustrating, but the leader must be up to the challenge. Not everyone on your team will be the same age. Not everyone on your team has the same experiences. It's your job to lead, even with these differences amongst your team. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you have any feedback or comments, please email me at shaney@realagriculture.com or call the Real Ag feedback line 855-776-6147. You can find more episodes of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast at mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Thanks to RBC Royal Bank, and until next time, keep on minding your farm business.